Not every Hollywood downfall came from a scandal, a blacklist, or bad luck. Some of the biggest names in film history lost everything because of something far more painful to watch: pure, avoidable stupidity. One actor turned down 3 of the greatest scripts ever written over reasons so shallow they still sound like a joke today. A child star spent his entire adult life acting like he was still 9 years old until one $50 argument ended his life at 31. A 5-time Olympic champion became a global icon without ever learning to act and quietly wandered off into a nursing home doing the same jungle yell for strangers who no longer recognized him. These aren't villains. They're men who had everything and threw it away with their own 2 hands, one avoidable decision at a time. Let's start with the one whose ending is the hardest to watch. Mickey Rooney wasn't just a star. At his absolute peak, he was the single biggest box office draw on the entire planet, consistently out-earning every other actor working in Hollywood as MGM's beloved Andy Hardy. By the late 1930s, he was pulling in the modern equivalent of nearly $300,000 a week, an almost unimaginable sum for the era. Across an astonishing 9-decade career and more than 300 films, Rooney generated what absolutely should have become one of the great, lasting fortunes in entertainment history. He blew through nearly all of it anyway. Rooney married 8 separate times over the course of his life, and the resulting divorce settlements alone drained millions of dollars from his pockets. His 4th wife's 1958 payout alone would be worth well over $4 million in today's money. He was also a genuinely compulsive gambler who simply couldn't walk away from the racetrack or the card table, chasing his mounting losses with borrowed money, year after year, decade after decade, digging himself deeper each time. Old studio contracts back then, unlike today, didn't include any residuals or royalties whatsoever. So unlike modern actors who benefit from their old work for decades, Rooney never earned a single cent from any of his old films airing again on television or later formats. Every single dollar had to come from active, ongoing work in real time, and the moment job offers slowed down even slightly, so did the income stream, keeping him financially afloat. By 1962, he was forced to file for bankruptcy with just $500 in cash against $500,000 in outstanding debt. He clawed his way back financially through sheer effort, only to lose it all over again years later, filing for bankruptcy a second time in 1996. In his final years, in a particularly sad twist, he even had to sue his own stepson in court, alleging the man had seriously mismanaged and drained what little money he had left to his name. When Mickey Rooney finally died in 2014 at age 93, remember, one of the highest-paid performers who ever lived in the history of the industry, his entire estate was valued at just $18,000 total. It stands today as one of the starkest, most sobering reminders in all of Hollywood history that a fortune earned during your career isn't remotely the same thing as a fortune actually kept and preserved. Rooney's problem was money he simply couldn't hold on to, but our next star's problem was a hard-earned reputation he couldn't stop drinking away, one bottle at a time, night after night. You were the single biggest action star on the entire planet, the man whose very own name literally became American slang for effortless success, immortalized in the phrase, "in like Flynn." And within a single decade, your own personal reputation becomes the exact thing that ultimately destroys you completely. That's precisely what happened to Errol Flynn, and it genuinely wasn't studio politics or string of bad scripts that did it to him. It was his own reckless personal choices, piling up relentlessly one after another until there was simply nothing left standing to protect him anymore. By the early 1940s, Flynn had absolutely everything a performer could want, leading roles in beloved classics like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, a glowing reputation as Hollywood's most charming rogue, and a carefully constructed public image resting entirely on the appealing idea that his wild personal lifestyle was just harmless fun for everyone involved. Then, in late 1942, 2 separate teenage girls formally accused him of statutory rape, with one alleged incident reportedly occurring right on his own yacht during a party. The resulting trial became a genuine national sensation covered extensively in newspapers nationwide, and although a jury ultimately fully acquitted him in 1943, the lasting damage to his public image proved completely permanent regardless of the actual legal verdict. Industry insiders would later say that particular trial genuinely marked the real beginning of his steady decline, both personally and professionally, from that point forward. Rather than course-correcting after such a genuinely close call with his career and reputation, Flynn instead doubled down hard on exactly the same reckless behavior that had put him in that courtroom in the first place. His drinking spiraled rapidly and steadily into full-blown, debilitating alcoholism over the following years. By his final years alive, he was reportedly working his way through 2 full liters of vodka every single day, his physical health visibly collapsing under the sheer weight of it all, and leaving him looking decades older than his actual real age to anyone who saw him. His very last film, a low-budget vanity project with minimal studio backing, paired him on screen with his final girlfriend at the time, a deeply troubling relationship that had disturbingly started when she was only 15 years old. Flynn died at just 50 years old, physically wrecked and professionally irrelevant by that point, having spent the entire back half of his once promising career quietly dismantling, piece by piece, the exact same legend his own early films had so carefully and successfully built for him. If you think a scandal alone can slowly kill a career over time, just wait until you see how a single 3-day party managed to end a beloved comedian's entire career in just one single week. Picture this scenario clearly. You're the highest-paid actor in all of Hollywood, a beloved comedian who's just signed a brand-new contract worth the modern equivalent of tens of millions of dollars. And within one single week, one party alone turns you into the most hated man in all of America, permanently, regardless of whatever the courts eventually decide about your actual guilt or innocence. That's precisely what happened to Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle in September of 1921. And while the full truth of that particular night still remains genuinely disputed among historians even to this day, one thing remains absolutely certain. Arbuckle's own choices surrounding that fateful weekend set the entire disaster firmly in motion from the start. Arbuckle was Paramount Pictures' biggest star at the time, having just signed a 3-year, $3 million contract when he made the decision to celebrate with a lavish, alcohol-fueled Labor Day party at a San Francisco hotel. During Prohibition, no less, when simply hosting that kind of gathering already carried serious legal risk on its own before anything else even happened. Actress Virginia Rappe fell severely ill during the course of the party, and tragically died just days later from her illness. Arbuckle was formally charged with manslaughter, and intensely sensationalized press coverage that followed almost immediately painted him as an outright monster in the public eye before he had ever even set foot inside an actual courtroom to defend himself. He endured 3 separate, grueling trials in total over the following months. The first 2 both ended in hung juries, unable to reach any verdict. It wasn't until the 3rd and final trial in 1922 that a jury finally, decisively acquitted him in just 5 minutes flat, and remarkably, they even issued a formal written apology to him directly, stating plainly that a simple acquittal alone wasn't nearly enough for everything he'd been unjustly put through by the process. But by that point, none of it truly mattered anymore to his career. Hollywood studios, desperate to distance the entire industry from any hint of scandal, banned him from appearing on screen outright and permanently. Arbuckle attempted a quiet comeback by directing films secretly under a fake name, but the damage to his reputation had already become permanent and irreversible. He spiraled into serious alcoholism afterward and ultimately died of heart failure at just 46 years old, a legally innocent man whose one single reckless decision to throw that particular party ended up costing him absolutely everything he had ever built over his entire career. Arbuckle lost his entire career to one single party, but our next legend actually signed away his own creative freedom completely willingly, on paper, in ink, despite his very closest friends personally begging him not to do it. Every kid growing up in the 1950s knew that cowlick, those freckles, and that deliberately terrible singing voice. Carl Alfalfa Switzer was one of the most recognizable faces in America thanks to the Our Gang shorts, delighting millions of young viewers week after week. But Hollywood has a brutal, well-documented habit when it comes to child stars. It builds them up carefully, profits enormously off their youth and their charm, and then discards them completely the second they stop being cute, without ever bothering to teach them how to survive what comes crashing down after. Switzer's real downfall wasn't simply aging out of a role, the way it happened to so many child performers of his era. It was that he genuinely never understood on any level that the game had fundamentally changed underneath him. As a kid working at Hal Roach Studios, he'd been treated like absolute royalty, free to pull pranks, disrupt entire sets, and generally act however he pleased, because he was simply too valuable financially to discipline properly. But once he grew into an awkward, lanky young man, no longer cute or marketable in the same way, he still fully expected that exact same red carpet treatment to continue indefinitely. He showed up to sets demanding star status he clearly hadn't earned in years, acting entitled instead of humble, arrogant instead of hungry for real work. He never bothered learning the deeper craft that mature, adult roles actually required of a serious performer. He just leaned harder and harder on an inflated sense of self-importance that steadily burned bridge after bridge with directors and co-stars who quickly found him genuinely impossible to work with on any project. The very industry that had built his ego in the first place didn't care one single bit about the psychological whiplash of losing child stardom overnight. They just saw a washed-up actor who wasn't useful to them anymore. Left to scrape by however he could, Switzer bounced between various odd jobs, including work as a hunting guide, all while making increasingly reckless decisions, almost as if consequences were simply something that only ever happened to other people, never to him. That dangerous mindset finally caught up with him for good, permanently. In early 1959, a seemingly minor argument over a lost hunting dog and a $50 reward spiraled rapidly into a violent confrontation that Switzer flatly refused to back down from, even as tensions escalated. He was dead at just 31 years old. Not from some glamorous Hollywood scandal splashed across magazine covers, but from a lifelong, tragic failure to ever understand the real weight of his own actions and choices. If you think losing your life over $50 is genuinely hard to process, just wait until you hear about the man who earned more money than almost anyone else in Hollywood history, and still somehow died with almost nothing left to show for it. By the late 1920s, Buster Keaton wasn't just a movie star in the traditional sense. He was genuinely one of the most successful independent filmmakers alive anywhere in the entire world at that time. He personally wrote, directed, produced, and starred in his own films, fully controlling every single creative decision himself down to the smallest individual stunt performed on camera. He owned a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills located right next door to Rudolph Valentino's own estate, earned the modern equivalent of $60,000 a week at his peak, and had successfully built from scratch exactly the kind of complete, total artistic freedom that most working performers could only ever dream of achieving in their careers. Then, in 1928, he threw all of it away entirely of his own free will. Keaton signed a contract handing his entire career directly over to MGM, chasing the tempting promise of long-term financial security and powerful studio backing behind him. Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, two of his closest personal peers and friends in the industry, both personally warned him repeatedly not to do it, telling him bluntly and honestly that he'd inevitably lose the very independence that made him who he genuinely was as a unique artist. Keaton simply didn't listen to either of them. He trusted a friend's casual promise that nothing would really change for him under the new arrangement. Everything changed almost immediately. MGM assigned him entire teams of staff writers, forced him through endless, tedious script committees, and buried his instinctive, spontaneous improvisational genius under thick layers of corporate bureaucracy, specifically built for actors who actually needed and wanted that kind of rigid structure, not remotely suited for a man whose entire creative process depended completely on the freedom to invent things as he went along on set. When Keaton pushed back hard and flatly refused to make films he genuinely considered inferior or beneath his standards, the studio simply fired him outright for being difficult to manage and control. The sudden loss of that creative control sent him spiraling hard and fast into serious alcoholism over the following years. The very same man who had once built the single most expensive and celebrated stunt shot in the entire history of movies was reduced to churning out cheap films he openly despised making. He later called it, in his own words, the absolute worst mistake of his entire life, a genuinely rare case of a true Hollywood legend destroying his own creative empire not through scandal or a single moment of stupidity, but instead by willingly and knowingly handing away the keys to it himself, with his own signature. Keaton lost absolutely everything by signing one bad deal, but our next actor lost his own shot at true immortality over something even smaller and pettier in comparison, pure, simple vanity. Bela Lugosi had just pulled off one of the truly great career triumphs in all of Hollywood history up to that point. His unforgettable 1931 performance as Count Dracula turned him into an overnight worldwide sensation and reportedly even helped save Universal Studios from complete bankruptcy during a difficult period. Naturally, given that success, the studio wanted to strike again while the iron was still hot from his breakout role. They were actively adapting another Gothic classic novel, Frankenstein, for the screen, and everyone involved simply assumed Lugosi would step directly into the lead role once again, given his recent horror success. There was just one significant catch, though. The producers didn't actually want him playing the mad doctor character this particular time around. They specifically wanted him playing the monster instead. Lugosi reluctantly agreed to sit for screen test anyway, and it's exactly at this point that his considerable ego took over completely and derailed everything. An argument broke out between him and the makeup team over exactly what the creature should ultimately look like on screen, and when Lugosi fully realized the role would bury his distinctive face under heavy layers of prosthetics and strip him of nearly all his spoken dialogue, he refused the part outright and completely, reportedly dismissing it publicly as fit only for a half-wit extra rather than a real actor. He didn't want to become completely unrecognizable to audiences. He didn't want to go entirely silent on screen. He wanted to remain a proper leading man, not become a lumbering prop for someone else's story. That single, fateful decision handed the role of an absolute lifetime to a relatively little-known actor named Boris Karloff instead, whose haunting, deeply sympathetic performance in the role made him an instant global star and the new defining face of horror cinema for generations to come. Lugosi, meanwhile, could only watch helplessly from the sidelines as the exact kind of iconic, genuinely career-defining part he had personally turned down became the single most famous monster in the entire history of movies. It was a devastating mistake he never fully recovered from for the rest of his career. As Karloff's star kept steadily rising through further hits like Bride of Frankenstein and The Mummy, Lugosi slid further and further down the cast lists over time, spending the remainder of his career chasing the very same kind of lasting stardom he'd once flatly refused to share the screen with, playing the exact creature role he'd turned down out of pride. But vanity certainly wasn't the only career killer running rampant through old Hollywood during this era. Sometimes all it really took was one actor's flat, stubborn refusal to even properly read his own scripts before casually saying no to them. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're one of the absolute biggest names working at Warner Brothers, with gritty gangster roles practically written specifically for your particular face and reputation, and 3 separate scripts land on your desk within a short span that will eventually go down in history as some of the most important films ever made in Hollywood. You say no to all 3 of them, one after another. That's precisely what George Raft did during the early 1940s, and the actual reasons behind his refusals weren't complicated artistic disagreements at all. They were, quite frankly, embarrassingly petty and shallow. He turned down the classic High Sierra simply because he personally didn't like the fact that his character died at the very end of the story. He walked entirely away from The Maltese Falcon because he flatly refused to work alongside some unproven rookie director named John Huston, someone he considered beneath his star status. Behind the scenes, industry insiders knew that Raft barely even bothered to read his own scripts in full. He'd routinely have assistants summarize the entire plot for him instead, then go on to make major, career-altering decisions based entirely on a rushed 2-minute verbal recap of the material. Warner Brothers didn't bother trying to fix his behavior or coach him through it. They didn't sit him down for any kind of serious heart-to-heart conversation about his choices. They simply suspended his pay outright and handed his rejected roles straight over instead to a struggling contract player named Humphrey Bogart, who happened to be available. The rest, as they say in the industry, is genuine film history from that point forward. Raft's real underlying problem was that he'd thoroughly confused his own carefully cultivated tough guy public image, bolstered significantly by genuine real-life friendships with actual mobsters like Bugsy Siegel, with actual, legitimate acting talent and skill. He treated all of Hollywood like a simple, natural extension of the criminal underworld he knew, instead of treating it like a real profession that constantly demanded growth, adaptation, and reinvention over time. When post-war audiences eventually started craving morally complex anti-heroes on screen, exactly the type of character Bogart was now perfecting brilliantly in film after film, Raft simply had absolutely nothing left to offer in response. No range as a performer, no capacity for reinvention, and no backup plan whatsoever for his career. By the 1950s, the phone had stopped ringing for him entirely, month after month. He eventually ended up quietly greeting guests at a London casino for a living, trading indefinitely on the fading memory of a once promising career he'd essentially handed away himself, one bad career call at a time. Raft's stubborn ego cost him absolutely everything he'd built, but our next star's entire career was instead built on something almost the complete opposite of genuine talent, a body that simply photographed perfectly, attached to a voice that simply couldn't act convincingly at all. In the early 1930s, the single highest-paid actor working at the most powerful film studio on the entire earth wasn't some polished, sophisticated leading man type at all, as one might reasonably expect. It was instead Wallace Beery, a hulking, heavy-set character actor who genuinely, sincerely struggled to fully comprehend his own dialogue and lines during filming. Beery went on to win a prestigious Academy Award and consistently dominated the box office for years, playing one very specific type of character over and over again throughout his career, the slow-witted brute with a hidden heart of gold buried somewhere underneath his rough exterior. Audiences watching him at the time genuinely believed they were witnessing brilliant, subtle acting from a true master craftsman at work on screen. The directors who actually worked closely with him on set day after day, however, knew a very different, far less flattering truth about the situation entirely. Beery genuinely wasn't acting at all in those particular moments audiences loved so much. That visible confusion, hesitation, and general slowness on set that came through so authentically on camera was simply, honestly, who he genuinely was as an actual person underneath it all, unintentionally dressed up on screen as a deliberate, calculated performance, one that the paying public simply couldn't seem to get enough of film after film, year after year, regardless of the underlying reality. It stands today as one of the strangest, most fascinating ironies in all of old Hollywood history. A man who genuinely struggled to fully understand the very scripts placed directly in his own hands somehow became one of the single highest paid, most reliably bankable stars of his entire era. Purely and simply because ordinary audiences of the time genuinely couldn't tell the meaningful difference between authentic acting talent and authentic, unintentional confusion playing out right in front of them. From George Raft's stubborn, self-destructive ego to Roscoe Arbuckle's one single fatal party, the underlying pattern never really changes across any of these remarkable stories. Hollywood didn't ultimately destroy these men through scandal, blacklists, or simple bad luck alone, as it might first appear. Genuine talent got every single one of them through the door in the first place, but it was ultimately unchecked ego, spiraling addiction, persistent denial, and a flat, stubborn refusal to ever properly adapt that quietly, permanently closed that same door behind them, one avoidable mistake at a time.